Hi, everyone. I want to devote this lecture to the events of the late 1980s, leading up to and including the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. Um, we need to first establish some background, just kind of recapitulate some of the things we've already talked about. In the 1980s, the most violent period of upheaval in South African history. There was a growing economic recession, which prompted calls for change, but also in some quarters led to continued intransigence. Certainly, the apartheid government, the National Party government, was very interested in trying to do whatever it could do to mitigate the effects of the recession. And this included especially trying to lift sanctions by looking like it was making reforms. But in many cases, it failed to make that kind of impression. We talked in a previous lecture about the talks conducted by a contingent of leaders from various Commonwealth countries in May 1986. This was ended rather abruptly when South Africa invaded several neighboring countries, which included a number of members of the Commonwealth, and this whole Commonwealth contingent left South Africa frustrated and sort of determined that the South Africans needed to be taught a lesson. Later in 1986, in June 1986, P.W. Botha's government declared a state of emergency and ramped up the efforts to contain the protests and the anti-apartheid activities. All of this at a time when it was also beginning to open up negotiations, right? So there are really kind of two things happening simultaneously that are totally in contradiction to each other. An enhanced government crackdown and the beginnings of negotiation channels that eventually do bear fruit, right? These seem totally at odds with each other, but this shows that the National Party government, first of all, was not entirely unified, and that there were a number of contingencies that members of that government were exploring, and the same really goes for the ANC and the other players in all of this, right? They were pursuing an armed struggle while at the same time conducting negotiations. The crackdown of the late 1980s was brutal, the record of atrocities from this period is shocking and horrible to read about. If you do not have the ability to sort of keep your emotions and your anger in check, I would not recommend looking closely into some of the events of this period. I recall as an undergraduate student myself reading in depth into some of the police activities, the use of torture and things like this during this period, and frankly coming into contact with some of the most shocking material I've ever seen in my life. I still have a hard time kind of reckoning with some of the things I read at that point. It is truly terrible. I will not go into a lot of detail about this, but suffice it to say that the police used whatever heinous methods they felt they needed to use, including some of the most brutal torture that I think has ever been devised by human beings to try to root out anti-apartheid operatives among the ANC and other groups during this period. As of 86 and 87, they banned most of the organizations and in some cases even the individuals associated with the organizations that had been legalized in the 1980s. The United Democratic Front, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, and other anti-apartheid groups were now banned, much like the ANC had been. Arrests were carried out in large numbers. The National Party government carried out assassinations of anti-apartheid activists both inside and outside of South Africa. They had been doing this already, but this was stepped up. And then the use of torture was, again, absolutely horrific. There are some accounts of this in the documents in the Williams book and in the Clark and Warger, the documents in the back of that book. I won't take time to look closely at them, but I did assign some of this material. You can get a sense of it. in the late 1980s, the government sent several thousand regular troops from the South Africa Defense Force into the townships to beef up the security presence there, to give aid to the police, and it was this only increased the brutality, the number of people killed, the amount of violence that was happening in those townships. It was every day, and it was tremendously violent. The foreign press was excluded from reporting on political events in South Africa as of late 1985. And so, not a lot of direct reports were getting out. There were few or no reporters from foreign press agencies, from the BBC, from Reuters, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, any of these, major news outlets who could operate in South Africa and report directly from the country. But news was leaking out to the outside, and certainly the international public was very much aware of what was going on there. As I've said, even as a child, I remember hearing lots and lots of news stories about the violence in South Africa, and just thinking that what a terrible place that must be. The National Party did make some appeasement efforts to try to turn back or rather to try to kind of buy off the Black African population. They created, for instance, something called the National Council, which was to be indirectly elected by all South Africans. This was a body of about, I think it was 59 councillors, 30 of which would be Black Africans, and they would advise the South African Parliament and the executive. But the blacks were not given direct representation, and this was not done by popular election. And so the population would elect people who would then elect the councillors, I believe. But this was never like a direct representation thing. When there were elections to determine this, very few people went to the polls. There were also local kind of councils like this, and again, these were not very popular. Anyone at this point seen working together with the apartheid government was often held up for opprobrium, and criticized, in some cases even, beaten up or killed by anti-apartheid protesters. There was little tolerance for any sort of collusion with the government at this point. At the same time as all of this was going on, as the clashes between the South African Defense Force, the police on one side, and anti-apartheid activists in the townships on the other side, there was also a lot of criticism of the government from the political right among the white population. The National Party was blamed, and this happens to every party in power when something bad is going on. Blamed for the wretched economy, blamed for the inability to stem the tide of violence, blamed for a lot of things. Blamed, frankly, for being too liberal and making too many concessions, right? I mean, something like the National Advisory Council was not popular because it was seen as a step toward full democracy and toward direct black elections, and the more conservative elements of the white population were opposed to this on principle, with the idea in mind that they needed to perpetuate the Verwoerdian, very strict apartheid system, that the homelands were really the only avenue for blacks to have any sort of political representation. Right? This was again always done out of a great deal of ignorance. But the National Party, in the eyes of many white South Africans, began to decline in popularity. We talked about the Conservative Party and the AVB, the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, or Afrikaner Resistance Movement, or resistance, independence. I can't remember what Weerstand means, but in any case, these are radically right conservative groups. The AVB even a sort of fascist paramilitary group. So anyway, all of that by way of recapping the stuff we've talked about. Last point here: black resistance continued and was stepped up. More campaigns of sabotage, more bombings. Even though COSATU and other union leadership organizations were banned in this period, they intensified their efforts to strike against industry, fomenting for higher wages and safer conditions, more benefits, all these things. Because most of the secular leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle were either in exile or in prison, the 1980s was a period when clergy members who were really sort of untouchable by the state, right? They could claim clerical privilege, were key in the anti-apartheid struggle. Foremost among these was the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop of Capetown, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, pictured here. Tutu was a voice of great moral reasoning. He was an impeccable character, one who no one really could criticize. He certainly wasn't very popular among many of the white population, but not someone that the government could arrest with impunity, because he was, of course, protected by the Church of England, which is an international organization. So, Tutu and the activities of other clergymen, both white and black, and I suppose colored and maybe even Indian, did put further pressure because they condemned the apartheid government on moral principle, right? And this was not something that the apartheid government wanted, besmirching their reputation. And so it reached a point where negotiations were really the only possible avenue to get out of this horrible conundrum that they were in. And frankly, that was true for both sides in this. That was true for the National Party government. It was true for the African National Congress. It was true for other groups, though in many cases, small minority groups like Inkatha in KwaZulu, which was perhaps a majority there rather than a minority, but a minority sort of countrywide. The Pan-African Congress and these conservative groups on the white right, they tended to oppose negotiations for one reason or another, because they felt that negotiations would not adequately represent their small minorities. But the major players politically in South Africa began to see no other alternative. So, for all of these factors, in addition to those factors, I should say, that we just talked about, the demographic trend was just against the white government, and this this is something they simply could not ignore. The white population in the 1960s had constituted about 21% of the population of South Africa. By the late 70s, that had dipped to about 15%, and it was becoming obvious that because of the disparity in birth rate, the African population was going to continue to grow as a percentage. They could not ignore this, or if they did, it was at their peril because of the international and, frankly, often domestic condemnation. We talked about the economics of this. One other point that I didn't mention was that part of the problem with the South African economy was that the public sector was absolutely bloated. The National Party government had created bureaucracy upon bureaucracy, many sort of parallel agencies within the government doing much the same job as other agencies were doing. A huge number of the white population were employed by the government, often in positions that were either superfluous or redundant. And so, this did not lend a lot of vitality to the economy. And so the government saw a need to privatize a lot, and really was trying to do that. But this was not popular, certainly with the white population. White views were beginning to change in a number of ways. The white population was becoming more polarized. There were a lot of whites, who were began to be more and more opposed to apartheid. Not just the liberals, who had kind of always been that, or the progressives, but even, more political moderates began to see that the only way out of this situation was to get rid of apartheid. At the same time, as we've said, sorry for the yawn. The white right was breaking away from the National Party and from that position criticizing them. Black views, in many cases, were also beginning to change for a number of reasons. One that we haven't mentioned was that blacks were in a more stable economic position than they had ever been. Some of the skilled labor positions, and even not necessarily management positions, but higher paying positions, had become open to black workers. From the late 70s on, there was a small but emerging and growing black middle class, and by sort of a share of the income, or rather the disposable income of South Africa, the African share was growing precipitously. And so they also had an interest in trying to stabilize the country through negotiation rather than continuing to carry on an armed struggle. The middle class did mean something, certainly, and came to support the ANC in huge numbers. The 1989 revolutions in other parts of the world changed the political calculus of South Africa. The Berlin Wall fell, Germany was reunited, the Velvet Revolution in Prague, in the Czech Republic, or I should say Czechoslovakia at that point. It later split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Poland, Lithuania, and the other Baltic states, right? These were all breaking away from the Warsaw Pact, declaring their independence, holding democratic elections. The specter of communism was not nearly as scary as of 1989 as it had been. It was, becoming pretty obvious to everyone that the Cold War was ending, that the Soviet Union had been stripped of much of the power that it had once held, that it itself was falling apart and in desperate need of change, and then Mikhail Gorbachev was bringing about some of that change, right? So the 1989 revolutions really left South Africa exposed. They had been able to perpetuate their system partly because they, declared themselves to be a bulwark against the spread of communism. Well, that didn't hold any credence anymore. It wasn't a way to achieve any kind of reputation internationally. So the ANC and the National Party began to reach out to each other in secret. Now, this is one of the, I think, in my opinion, more interesting chapters in South African history. The open-mindedness, frankly, the heroism on both sides is really compelling and really commendable. It's this part of Nelson Mandela that I admire the most. Mandela is, in my opinion, to be, should be held up as one of the most admired and morally righteous, if I can use that terminology, figures in all of human history. Certainly one of the giants of one of the greats of the modern period. But part of that, a lot of that, had to do with his willingness, despite the suffering that he and his family had endured at the hands of the apartheid government, his willingness to open his mind to try to understand the position of the Afrikaners. While Mandela was in prison on Robben Island, he learned Afrikaans well, and not just to speak it to the guards, but to read it. He read Afrikaans history. He read its poetry. He read, the hymns and songs in Afrikaans. He read Afrikaner accounts of the Great Trek. He came to know the mind of the Afrikaners. And so when he reached out to them, as he did in the 1980s, on a frequent basis, he was able to do this from the viewpoint of empathy. Now, I think that's one of the great moral examples in all of human history. This is a guy who was living in an 8-foot by 8-foot cell for more than 20 years. and subjected to hard labor conditions in the rock quarries on Robben Island day after day after day, something that compromised his health severely. This was a very unhealthy environment to work in. The rock dust and things like this really hurt his lungs. But despite all of that, he opened his mind to try to understand why the Afrikaners had instituted apartheid, why they felt so strongly that they needed to continue with this. And it was from that viewpoint of empathy that Mandela was able to reach out to them. I love this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of all of the 20th century. This is Mandela in his prison cell, of course, well after his release. I think it was during the filming of a documentary. You can see the microphone on his shirt there. But he, went back to his cell that he lived in for more than 20 years and kind of looked out the window like, well, that's a familiar view, right? And this is after he'd become president. Starting in the mid-1980s, agents of the Botha government began to talk to Mandela. Initially, they did it really from a kind of viewpoint that they could intimidate him and use him, co-opt him somehow. They made offers to him that they would release him from prison immediately if he would renounce the militant struggle against the apartheid government, if he would give up any political career, if he would retire into private life and make statements condemning the armed struggle. He would be returned to his family, be able to live in private life. Mandela refused this. He bought himself about 5 more years of prison as a result, right? But he refused to do that. They offered, and they even sort of would make an offer without any hope for, or without initially asking for anything in return. So in 1985, they moved him from Robben Island to Poolsmoor Prison outside of Capetown into much more comfortable circumstances, a bigger cell and things like this. He even got to take along some of his closest confidants, including Walter Sisulu, with him. When Mandela proved to be difficult when he refused all of their offers, they isolated him. They cut him off from Sisulu and others. But he continued to hold out and refused to sort of play their game, right? Knowing that he could negotiate from a position of strength if he simply held out. They finally, in 1988 or early 89, I can't remember which one, they moved him to another prison east of Capetown in the city of Paarl, or near Paarl. And this was more of a house arrest type situation. He was actually able to receive visitors and live, in what looked like fairly normal domestic circumstances, though technically still in prison, right? So Mandela was able to stand strong against their demands, and all through the late 1980s, this was kind of the back and forth. Now, the other thing about the Mandela talks is that Mandela had no way of communicating with Oliver Tambo and other operatives of the ANC who were not in prison. This was done probably without their knowledge, not because Mandela wanted to keep them out of it, because he had no way of contacting them. He, I think this is about 87 or 88, contacted some of the agents of the South African government, Kobe Coetzee and Neil Barnard, and had personal talks with each of these negotiators and convinced them, sort of won them over to the position that apartheid should end, that there should be democratic elections. And he did this again from the viewpoint of empathy, right? So Mandela began to win over some of the negotiators who were supposed to be operating in the interests of the National Party government. There were other meetings, and this is another part of the story that's really quite fascinating. ANC officials in England, especially the ANC Information Director Thabo Mbeki. Mbeki's another really compelling figure. We'll see he succeeds Mandela as the second democratically elected president of South Africa in 1999. Mbeki was a very disarming individual. He had a master's degree in economics from Sussex University in the UK. One of the things that was really appealing to many about Mbeki was that he smoked a pipe. And you might say, okay, that's I mean, I personally would say that's disgusting. I don't want to be around somebody smoking a pipe. That makes me cough or sneeze or whatever. But, I mean, he looked the part of a little English gentleman, right? And he kind of had that sort of demeanor. He'd spent much of a lot of time in the UK and kind of adopted, the persona, so to speak. And this was very disarming to people. And, I'm not, that's not my own judgment. This comes from many articles I've read about Thabo Mbeki and about these negotiations, that it was his English gentleman personality that really won people over, right? The ANC made a declaration in 1989, August 1989, from the city of Harare in Zimbabwe, where they declared that, that they called for an end to apartheid and expressed a willingness to negotiate with the National Party government to have a peaceful transition. Um, Not to, this wasn't a declaration that they were going to end the armed struggle, but they kind of made that offer, right? That if this was to be a peaceful transfer, we will stop the militancy, we will negotiate, we will have fair talks and open talks, public talks, and so the Harare Declaration was, I think, an important step in this. P.W. Botha failed to respond in kind, even though at times he used rhetoric, to try to win over the black population. Botha was simply unwilling, ultimately, to wrap his mind around the idea that there would ever be a true democracy in South Africa. He was afraid the Afrikaners would be annihilated if this was the result, right? And in essence, Botha was worried that the blacks would act like the whites had in ruling over South Africa. They would oppress, the white population, that they would carry out massacres of them, that they would use the apparatus of the state, right? I mean, Botha and many other Afrikaners were convinced of this and really could never get past it. As late as August 1988, Botha was making statements that to the effect that he hadn't even considered and would never consider true democratic elections. And so when Botha had a stroke in January of 1989, and as his popularity continued to wane thereafter, as he was not able to fully function as the president of South Africa, his failure just became all the more apparent, not only to those who opposed him, but even to those in his government, right? And especially Frederick Wilhelm de Klerk, who ended up succeeding him. Now, de Klerk is an interesting personality, one that, is not. I mean, if you just look at his early career and his rhetoric, you would not anticipate that this is the guy who's going to end apartheid, or at the very least, that he's going to be the one to open up full negotiations with the ANC. He had been a good foot soldier in the apartheid government. He had never held any really prestigious cabinet positions. He was not a very well-known commodity, despite being a member of parliament for decades. He was, at the time that Botha stepped down, the education minister, and he had been the Minister of Mining and the Minister of Housing and a couple of other things earlier in his career. But the leadership vote coalesced around de Klerk. He became the president in the second half of 1989, and almost immediately he made, as I say here, an about face. Now, why did de Klerk do this? Why did he, on the 2nd of February 1990, make a statement? This is, by the way, I'm not going to take time to read it, but a document in the Williams book, de Klerk's statement about actually, is this in the Williams book? I guess it's in the Clark and Warger book. My apologies. I thought that, yeah. It's document number 14 in that, right? Let me just read a little bit of it. Okay, the steps that have been decided on are the following: the prohibition of the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, and a number of subsidiary organizations is being rescinded. People serving prison sentences merely because they were members of one of these organizations or because they committed some other offense, which was merely an offense because a prohibition on one of the organizations was in force, will be identified and released. Prisoners who have been sentenced for other offenses, such as murder, terrorism, or arson, are not affected by this, although they ended up releasing some who had been involved in the sabotage campaigns. The media emergency regulations as well as the education emergency regulations are being abolished in their entirety, right? So foreign press allowed back in, reporting with candor allowed again, some of the strictures on schools to try to protect the government, all of that was done away with. And then the final point, the period of detention in terms of the security emergency regulations will be limited henceforth to 6 months. Detainees also acquire the right to legal representation and a medical practitioner of their own choosing. And so the police policy of holding people for indefinite periods, even without charges, and not allowing them any legal representation, and or frankly medical care in there, despite torture, all of that was done away with in this declaration of de Klerk in February 1990. And that this is followed by Mandela's release from prison on the 11th of February 1990. One of the great pictures of the 20th century here at the bottom. Nelson Mandela with his wife Winnie, displaying symbols of victory, marching in Capetown after on the day of his release from prison. Why did de Klerk do this? Well, I'm not sure that anyone apart from de Klerk himself will ever truly know this. His brother, in an interview, said at one point that de Klerk had a kind of religious conversion where he came to be convinced that apartheid was an evil system and needed to be done away with. So, I mean, maybe we need to take that at face value, right? It was pretty obvious that apartheid was not a workable system, that this needed to end. And so he took these steps. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is over, right? We cannot jump from the release of Mandela in 1990 to Mandela's election in April of 1994. A lot happens in the ensuing years, I should say the intervening years between February 1990 and April 1994 that we need to talk about. This is a great case study in the creation of democracy and the writing of constitutions, and it's a fascinating story in its own right. So we'll turn our attention to that in the next lecture.